So the first thing that I wanted to kind of review that might help you if you're studying for the final exam or you are working on the data project is to go over aggregate supply and aggregate demand again. So aggregate demand is downward sloping, short run aggregate supply is upward sloping, and then we have a vertical long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so long run aggregate supply is here, it's the red line. Short run aggregate supply curve is here, that's the purple line. Aggregate demand is here, that is the downward sloping line. Remember, our quantity variable is GDP, real GDP. Our price indicator is price level, which could be CPI or some other inflation or price level. So the first step is that we need to identify our macroeconomic equilibrium, which is going to be where short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, the quantity of them are equal. So if we move down to the GDP axis or the x-axis, we find y star right here. Actually, let me write that with text instead of drawing it. So we have y star there. Then we have y sub p, which is our potential real GDP here at the long run aggregate supply curve. So our potential real GDP is kind of comparing where we would expect to be given our economic circumstances. So again, y star is where we're actually at. Y sub p is what our target would be based on the amount of people we have, the skill sets we have, the capital investment that we have. We also need to identify our price. So if we go over to the y-axis here, we get PL star, which is our price level at that point. Now, the reality is that our actual equilibrium is less than our potential GDP. So Y star is less than Y sub P. That is what we identify as an output gap. So typically, if we have an output gap that's like really close, let's say we're like right here, we put a dot. Let's say we were like right here, that little purple dot right there, near the YP line. If we were there, probably the market corrects itself and we don't really have to worry so much about some sort of policy that needs to be immediately implemented by some government entity to help boost economic activity. But if we're out here, this is probably saying, okay, well, at Y sub P, unemployment's probably around 4%. And at this point, unemployment's probably around 6.5%. Oh, I didn't mean to put a caret there. 6.5%. So if we're at 6.5%, that's quite a significant level of cyclical unemployment that again occurs from recessions or coming out of recessions. So this might be a time for an expansionary policy. So when we engage in expansionary policies, we're trying to boost aggregate demand. So we're trying to get the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Now, there are a couple of ways we could do that. We could engage in expansionary fiscal policy. So you have two options there. You can increase government spending, or you can decrease taxes. Now, if you increase government spending, you're going to get an initial bump, assuming that government spending is on projects, not transfer payments. Again, like stimulus checks could boost economic activity and aggregate demand through consumption, but there's no guarantee. The people that are receiving those checks don't necessarily have to spend that money right away. So you don't get any necessarily direct contribution, you might get indirect contribution. So if the government invests in an infrastructure project, okay, well, there's initial spending and production coming from that. Then those workers will spend money, and those companies will spend money, and then so you end up getting a multiplier effect. You can also have a similar impact on decreases in taxes. You get a reduction in taxes for households or firms. You get a boost in spending from those sectors of the economy immediately. The difference, though, being that if you decrease taxes at the household level, so at the households, you get an MPC of about 0.85. If you cut taxes at the firm level or the corporate level, you only get an MPC of 0.12. So if you use the multiplier effect, you get probably about a 25% boost. From corporate tax cuts, you get about a 600% boost from household tax cuts. Regardless of what you choose, the goal is to result in the aggregate demand curve shifting to the right and getting closer to this market equilibrium here, or so this long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So that's what's trying to happen with expansionary fiscal policy. Now let's say that instead you want to engage in expansionary monetary policy. So expansionary monetary policy instead. Then you're going to have a more indirect change. So let me draw a second graph, a smaller graph here on the side. So this graph here is going to be the market for loanable funds. So when you're borrowing money, well, then your quantity is going to be measured in money. And then the price of borrowing money is interest rate. So that's going to be measured by I, your interest rate. So we will have a downward sloping money demand curve. And we will have a vertical money supply curve. So this red line is your money supply. This black line is your money demand. So if the Federal Reserve wants to engage in expansionary monetary policy, what they're going to do is they're going to try and engage in open market operations that allow for them to inject or pull out money supply from the open economy. If they want to inject money into the economy, what they want to do is they want to buy securities. Securities are assets that you can trade for money, but they aren't actually money, so you can't really do anything with them until you sell them to somebody else. You don't have any cash in hand until it either matures and you get it paid off, or somebody buys it off of you. So the central bank, the Federal Reserve in the United States, can go into that open market and buy those securities off of people. And if they go buy and those securities off those people, instead of there being bonds circulating in the economy, there's now cash because they were paid for those securities. And instead of the securities being floating around in the market, it's now money. So how do we visualize that? Well, that's going to be a increase in the money supply. So we're going to shift the money supply curve to the right to MS2. So before we had an equilibrium interest rate at MS and MD. So we had I1 or I star. So we had I star. Well, now we have a new equilibrium here. And we have a new interest rate at I2 star. Well, I2 star is now lower. Well, as we have lower interest rates, we shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Because if interest rates are lower, it's now cheaper to borrow for households. It's now cheaper to borrow for businesses. And so there's an incentive for them to actually go and borrow that money, buy a car, buy a house, invest in new capital projects for the business. And as a result, you end up with lower interest rates, shifting aggregate demand, and trying to boost up from your initial equilibrium. So yes, you'll have higher prices in that context, but you'll also have more output that approaches that equilibrium that you're looking for. So here you'd have Y3 or Y2 star. You'd have PL2 star. And so you ultimately end up with a value that is approaching your equilibrium in the long run, your long run macroeconomic equilibrium. Your long run macroeconomic equilibrium is kind of what you're targeting. You want SRAS to be equal to LRAS, which is equal to AD. This is what you're targeting. When they're all equal, that's what happens. So that's how expansionary policy works. Usually necessary when you have some significant output gap. So what if the opposite is true? What if we have circumstances where we have a potential inflationary gap? Well, first off, what's an inflationary gap? An inflationary gap is going to occur when your Y sub star, or not a subscript, but Y star, your macroeconomic equilibrium, GDP level, your output level, is actually higher than your long run potential real GDP. So here we have Y sub P. We have our real GDP here. We have our price level here. And we have this intersection point here where SRAS is equal to AD that determines our actual price and output level in the current economic situation. So we have PL star here. We have our Y star here. And so we have a situation where at that equilibrium point, Y star is greater than YP, which means we have an inflationary gap. So why do we call it an inflationary gap? Well, the reason why it's an inflationary gap is, remember, this is like your full employment level, 4%. So let's say we have like 3.5% unemployment here. Well, the issue with that is that not necessarily that it's bad that we're not producing enough. We're actually producing where we are. We're actually overshooting our targets, which seems great. But in order for that to be sustainable, you have to be able to be boosting your long run economic factors. So education levels, workers available, physical capital, skill sets for workers, technological innovation. Similar to what we see with the production possibilities frontier that we learned at the beginning of the class. And so the consequence here is that if there's a level of unemployment that is below full employment, that means that there's a shortage of workers. So if you see that the economic conditions are strong and you feel like you're incentivized to try and boost your own economic activity as a business, you might start a business or you might expand your business, try to hire workers in, and unfortunately, what ends up happening is you can't find anybody to fill those jobs. So option one is that you stop trying and then you don't get any sort of economic boost from that. Or you keep trying to try and get more output for your own personal company. So what do? You basically go and try and hire workers from somebody else, from somewhere else. Well, in order to entice workers to come from working for you to somewhere else, you pay them more money. Well, one of the factors on the short run aggregate supply curve is that when we start raising wages, ceteris paribus, with no kind of improvements to long run economic factors, we end up seeing a shift to the left of the short run aggregate supply curve. So we move from SRAS1 to SRAS2. This is if we don't do anything. If we don't do anything, then the market will kind of push upward pressure on wages due to the fact that there's a labor shortage and there's people trying to do work, so they're trying to siphon off workers from other people. Well, if they work at a new firm, they're probably not going to have much of a net change in positive productivity, but higher wages will reduce budgets for firms, which will make them produce less. And so we end up moving backwards from Y star back to YP, and in the process, we end up dealing with higher prices. So barring some sort of technological advancement, skill boost, capital investment that results in LRAS and SRAS shifting to the right to offset this inflationary gap, we will undertake and experience inflation as well as economic reduction as a consequence of that higher price. So this is when we would implement some sort of contractionary policy. Contractionary policies try to slow the economy down so inflation doesn't get out of control. Now, we theoretically have a contractionary fiscal policy, which could be raising taxes or cutting spending. So those are the fiscal policy opportunities. Raising taxes, not popular with constituents. Cutting spending, cutting programs that people rely on. Cutting infrastructure opportunities that don't help fix our bridges and roads. Those aren't popular with constituents. Some candidates will run always talking about that that the government needs to be more fiscally responsible, and yes, they can be. But I've read a lot of PhD literature that the inefficiencies aren't because we're spending too much money, it's because and the projects are bad. It's actually more so that we have either red tape or we have some sort of inefficiency baked into it where people aren't executing the projects efficiently. So that doesn't mean lay off millions of people. That doesn't mean get rid of Social Security and Medicare. It really just means that we need to streamline processes so that way they aren't being wasted. But some candidates will suggest that we should do some sort of cutting to certain programs or projects or whatever. But one, those aren't popular with people who vote. And two, they probably won't be as effective as they think. Or three, they'll say they do it, people will agree with them, they'll vote with them, and then they won't do it because they realize that if they actually execute that it will hurt people that voted for them. And then the next cycle, they will vote them out, or they'll come with pitchforks. So usually contractionary policy is reserved for the central bank, so monetary policy. So contractionary monetary policy basically works in the opposite direction of expansionary monetary policy. So you sell securities, reduce money supply, and that raises interest rates. So over the last, I don't know, between 2021 and 2024, you basically had the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, doing this exact thing. We were dealing with inflation that was around, I don't know, at its peak, 7.5% to 8% in late 21, early 22, dropped down to about 4%. Then as of late 24, you're down to about 2% year over year, which is really what the kind of average economic target is. So by implementing this contractionary policy, they have actually been pretty successful at slowing inflation down in a matter of 2 years. Part of that's due to the fact that a lot of the factors that caused the inflation were not necessarily due to overshooting, but more so due to COVID issues, tax cuts in 2017, coupled with supply chain issues from COVID, coupled with money supply increasing from COVID, coupled with housing demands and tastes and preferences changing in a very short period of time, while you don't have the ability to grow that infrastructure out. So that's really what caused the inflation, but there was also things done by the government to try and kind of boost economic investment through infrastructure stuff, coupled with this contractionary monetary policy tool. So what are we going to see visually on the graph as a result of a contractionary monetary policy or even a contractionary fiscal policy? We would see the aggregate demand curve shift to the left, and we would end up moving down. And so this looks bad because your actual output level is lower now at that equilibrium point. So here you have a lower equilibrium output level. But you also have a lower price. And so if the economy is going to contract a little bit no matter what, you might as well deal with it with lower prices as opposed to higher prices. So if we do nothing and we don't worry about interest rates and we let the market take care of itself, it's going to end up here at YP anyway, ceteris paribus. So would you rather be at PL2 or PL3? I'd rather be at PL3. So that's how contractionary policy works. Again, monetary policy is more indirect. So what you're actually seeing is we have to draw that market for loanable funds again. What you're seeing is this situation where money supply was here, and now we're shifting it back to here. So MS1 is here. MS2 is here. Market demand is here. Amount of dollars being borrowed is here. And your interest rate is here. So initially you have your equilibrium interest rate right here at I1, I star, and then you have a new equilibrium at I2. Okay, so at I2, you have less people borrowing money because of the fact that it's more expensive. Well, if it's more expensive, then you're going to get a reduction in consumption and investment as a result. And that shifts aggregate demand back into the left. So that's the graphical visualization of what's going on. If you're doing the data research project, still you're going to have to kind of use actual economic data to kind of make the argument of what situation we might be in, or if we're in a different situation than the two examples I've given you here. You should be using some of this theory in that project, but also even if you've already done the project, if you're working and preparing for the final exam, you should also be utilizing this logic and these graphs because basically it helps give you a visualization of what's going on at a simple level. But please note that there's a lot of complicated um, stuff going on behind the scenes. So in order to understand interest rate changes affecting aggregate demand, you have to understand through monetary policy, you have to understand one, monetary policy affects money supply, which is going to affect interest rates, as we see on this graph on the left. And then it's easy to see that interest rates being higher would lower demand for loans, but that affects consumption investments, so we would shift aggregate demand to the left. So that's basically how aggregate supply and aggregate demand are working within the context of policy. The next thing that I wanted to discuss has to do with aggregate expenditures and long-run growth. So a different model we had before aggregate supply and aggregate demand is we had aggregate expenditures. So on aggregate expenditures, we had real GDP or Y on your horizontal axis. And then for your vertical axis, you had aggregate expenditures. You had a 45-degree line that went in between these two that basically indicated your equilibrium point where GDP and aggregate expenditures are the same. Remember that aggregate expenditures is upward sloping. So you have aggregate expenditures that looks like this. Also remember about consumption and its relationship. So consumption is going to be down here. Let me use a different color so it's easier to tell the difference. So you have this graph here, this line here. This actually represents consumption. So consumption has the same slope as aggregate expenditures because the upward slope of aggregate expenditures is entirely related to consumption and consumption only because we consider planned investment, government spending, and net exports to be exogenous or determined outside of the model. So the MPC is the slope, same slope here. The difference between this purple line and this brown line really is the exogenous factors. So your exogenous factors are planned investment, government spending, and net exports. This gap right here is actually your autonomous consumption. So there is a level of consumption that you would undertake even if there was no income level coming in. So this upward slope is saying the extra consumption related to new income levels. Whereas if you had no money, you wouldn't stop spending money. So the autonomous consumption is that gap between the 0 point and the gold or brown line. And then the distance between 0 and the purple line coming out of the axis is your overall autonomous expenditures. And so there were variables that affected a bunch of stuff, which you should make sure that you go back and review. So with consumption, you have expected future income, you have tax rates, you have interest rates, you have wealth levels. When it comes to and interest rates, when it comes to firms, you have taxes, cash flow, expectations of profitability, interest rates. For net exports, you have foreign variables like exchange rates and growth rates in the rest of the world relative to here. You have prices in foreign countries and how that affects exports and imports. All of those things changing, including prices, is going to result in the aggregate expenditure line shifting up or down based on those other factors. So let's say that AE2 shifts up due to a decrease in prices. So a decrease in the price level. So here you had an equilibrium point here for your level of GDP. When you shift the aggregate expenditures line up, you end up having a higher level of GDP due to lower prices. Okay. So you're at Y2 star. So because this line corresponded with price level, let's say, I don't know, 205, and this one corresponded with price level 199, you can actually take that information, and that's what derives your aggregate expenditures line in the, excuse me, your aggregate demand curve in the ADAS model. So if we plot GDP here, we plot price level here, we can basically create a point here that corresponds with Y1 and a point here that corresponds with Y2. So this is a L, not an I. And then we can connect the dots. When we connect the dots, we end up with our aggregate demand curve. And so if things are complicated, please go back and review all of those variables and the relationships they have on aggregate expenditures, which will have the same effect on aggregate demand. So this price level was 205, and this one was 199. So that's taking the macroeconomic equilibrium points from the AE model, plotting them over here on the ADAS model, and that's how we derive our aggregate demand curve. So does anybody have any questions so far?